In episode 6 of the original Ranma 1 half TV series, there is a sequence where Ranma and Akane get fast food together. They both sit at the park eating burgers, by which I mean several burgers. They both have like at least three. They sure have an appetite. Most significantly, though, this scene does not have an equivalent to the original source material and is in fact sandwiched between several scenes that were not in the manga. The episode is an adaptation of a 20-page chapter of the manga. This one chapter spanned the entire events of this episode. For comparison, this same chapter amounted to 4.5 minutes of a single episode in the remake. That is very large discrepancy for how much is included in two different adaptations of the same story. The biggest difference, of course, being that while the remake attempts to be a direct translation, almost following the exact pacing of the panels, the original series took the time to let the characters breathe, have moments in between key points. While the remake got to this scene and this chapter to adapt within 3 episodes, the original story took twice as long. Even more notably, too, is the fact that all of these extra scenes have pretty much nothing of note happen. Ranma and Akane are just going home from school. The Akane's skipping rocks out of frustration over the whole Dr. Tofu plot that's happening in that episode. And then once she runs out, she throws a boulder because she can. Pretty strong girl. For the most part, it's a typical interaction. The two tease each other, make fun of each other, but they also slowly start to get along in a way that shows them kind of softening up each other despite being very passive aggressive. Then they just get burgers. There's this minutes long sequence where Akane crumples up her burger wrapper, aims for the garbage bin, and then tosses the wrapper only to miss. Then they painstakingly animate her getting up, walking to the wrapper, and picking it up so that she could sit down and try again. And this time she does get it in the bin and she looks proud of herself, only for Rama to be like, well, big deal, you still missed. And eventually the two resume talking about the actual plot of the episode, but not until after we've had this entire sequence of just two teenagers having a normal interaction. This fleshes out their eventual character arc and, well, lets the audience have some moments of silence. Something you don't usually get in the manga or the remake. This is a very different feeling from what Rumiko Takahashi originally envisioned. And yet it's from the era of the TV show that people remember most fondly. I always think that's very interesting. Hey, folks, and a yappa to you. I'm flying solo today. That's me, of course, Elena, your host. Today, you're joining me in your favorite Rama One Half podcast, Don't Know What to Do. And you might be wondering, well, why am I all alone? Who am I going to give trivia to about the time Shampoo's sisters came from China to beat up Ranma with like a fake paper mache dragon or something? But that maybe that's for another time. For today, I want to talk about a couple of things. Let's get a bit more personal. I don't have anyone to bounce off of today, mainly because I don't want to bore anyone with the details. But we're about 5 episodes into this podcast, and I think it's about time we really get to the core of what is don't know what to do about. So far, we've enjoyed giving examples of wacky little snippets of what the series has to offer. And that is definitely a very large portion of the series. After all, when you get that many episodes and that many chapters, you're inevitably going to have a lot of fluff and goofiness to it. It doesn't matter how you start off, that's where you're going to end up. Of course, I started with an example of how that's not always the case. If you have seen GIFs of the original Ranma One Half series, whether through social media or through city pop compilations on YouTube, chances are very likely that that animation came from the first season of Ranma One Half. For those unaware, the Ranma anime series had a somewhat complex history. Well, I say somewhat, but it's actually quite simple. It bombed. It did terribly at the start. Some people liked it, but ratings were terrible. People would rather watch a show about some little rich boy, just getting up to wacky shenanigans with like poop on a stick or something. Uh, but that's clearly a different audience than what the first season of Ranma One Half was going for. Either way, though, wasn't getting in the ratings, so things were retooled. People in charge were switched around, and although most of the team stayed the same, the series underwent a very different direction, one that is more faithful to the tone of the original manga. It was moved to a new time slot, given a completely different budget, which of course led to some less pretty landscapes, although it's still a pretty show, I would say. And we got the series that a lot of people would eventually drop after another season or two. Very few stuck around to the end, and the Ranma series, some might say unceremoniously, just sort of ended midway through what would be the full run of the manga storyline. Not that it mattered though, since the stories were all episodic. You could literally have the final story from the manga play immediately after the final story of the anime, despite there being more than 100 chapters in between them. And in fact, that's what a lot of people do. Very commonly, people watch Ranma until they fall off, and then they skip to the end out of curiosity, only to find out that it wasn't really that important, anyways. You got the gist, and you don't need to finish all the way through. You most certainly don't need to do what I did and spend 6 months going through every piece of media. So, why did I do that? Eh, there's a few things to consider. So, let's unpack that. On the 11th of July, 2024, I sat down to watch my very first episode of Ranma One Half. I knew of the series and what it was about. I knew the main character, and I had heard of a few names. But other than that, I had zero information about what the series was like. I've seen people mention it more often, but it was mostly about the impact it had left, namely among like the trans community or something, which is funny because that is absolutely not what stuck to me after going through the whole thing, but it's what stuck with a lot of people. Either way, I went in blind. And after a while, I realized that a lot of these stories were exclusive to one version or another. If even if I watched all 161 episodes, that's still hundreds of chapters from the manga that I would not know about. And if I only read the manga, that's still dozens of filler episodes and movies and other supplementary materials that I would not experience. So eventually I made the decision, well, if I started this series, I may as well do it all. I did what I like to call a deep dive, where you just sort of go digging into all the crevices of a series and experience everything it has to offer. Now, I did this despite having no nostalgia for Ranma One Half. I didn't watch it as a kid, and it wasn't that significant to me, despite comparisons to other people's experiences. But I still wanted to do the deep dive anyway, because, well, I just like doing that. It's fun to do a deep dive to a series. Obviously, you can't do that for everything. A lot of people in the modern day like to get into Gundam, and they start with the original series, but then they jump around a lot. You can't expect someone who wants to get into Doctor Who to actually consume every piece of Doctor Who media that they can possibly find. That would be insane. For a lot of series, especially older series that were around for quite some time, it's pretty daunting to experience everything. It's unreasonable to expect someone to go through the Ranma experience that I have, which is why, overwhelmingly, from what I've seen, most people do not have the experience that I do. Most people are fairly uninformed, relatively speaking, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Of course, they're uninformed. It would be ridiculous to educate yourself on all of that 161 episodes, 407 chapters, 14 video games, most of which aren't even translated into English. I would never ask someone to go through all that. I would never expect anyone to be familiar with all that information. I only did it for myself because I wanted to. It's fun to gain context. It's fun to learn things and gain an understanding of something you knew nothing about before. Like I always say, there's always something to gain from any experience, so long as you approach it in good faith. This far in, I've now started a podcast. I have learned a couple of new skills just for the purpose of getting my thoughts out there. Simply because, well, if I don't, who will? I'm a lot like the giver. I remember it so you don't have to. Because I don't want other people to watch all of Ranma. I don't want everyone else to do what I did. That's ridiculous. I respect your time more than that. I do, however, think that context is good. And even if I can only share a fraction of that context, I would be more than happy to do so. After all, I wouldn't be hosting a podcast unless I felt I had enough things to talk about. I have so many notes, so many things to review, so many different aspects of the series to cover. I barely scratched the surface. So, up until now, I suppose you could say that I've been recording episodes with the intention of giving listeners a taste of the more absurd things in Rama that you might not know about. You might not know about all the different weirdos. Hell, you might know literally nothing. You might have literally watched your very first episode because of this podcast. Who knows? Regardless, there's always something to learn and there's always something to teach. So, I want to share a bit of that. And I also want to encourage people to maybe do the same. I don't particularly like Ranma all that much. It's a good series. I think it's funny. I think it's interesting. But again, I've got no nostalgia for it. It's far from my favorite series. It's not something I would recommend people to get into unprompted. But I still really valued the experience I had with it, because even if Ranma was the worst series I ever saw, I would still find value in doing such a deep dive. There's always value to find, so long as you approach in good faith. So the quality doesn't matter. And I think everyone, at least once in their life, should do a deep dive. And no, just binging a show isn't enough. When I say deep dive, I mean deep dive. I had to learn MSX emulation. I had to figure out all kinds of things that I never would have had to do. I looked up albums, I listened to songs, and tried to look up old 90s singles just to find the more obscure things. That's not the same as simply clicking play and binging hundreds of shows. In fact, even if that's what you wanted to do, I would recommend not doing that. I actually watched one episode of Ranma every night. It just became a nighttime ritual. That's how I did deep dives before. Prior to Ranma, I watched all of Cardcaptor Sakura because I never got to watch it. And I felt like I want to know about it. So I tried to watch it and I was like, that's like 80 episodes. That's way too much. But it's a lot easier to get through if you just watch one episode a night. After all, back in the day, people had to wait an entire week between episodes. These old shows aren't made to binge. It's not the same when you just go through it all rapid fire. You're going to burn out. But if you just have it on passively in your life, just something that you tune in and check out one episode at a time, you'll eventually get to the end and you'll eventually gain something from that experience. That is what I want to share. I want to share that feeling of getting 50 or so episodes into something and seeing how much you still have left and realizing you're learning too much. You need to share this somehow. That's what I'm doing. And who knows, maybe you'll start your own podcast in the future, or maybe you'll just tell your friends about it. There's a lot of stuff I've consumed that I've never really talked in depth about. I'm one of maybe 5 people in the world who have watched all of Mrs. Columbo. Boy, are there stories there for me to tell you. But that's for a different time. Maybe you found a similar thing of your own, something that you've done a deep dive into simply because it's fun to do so. It's fun to gain that context. If you perhaps have never done something like that before, if you're used to looking into what other people recommend or only looking at the most popular parts of a series. If you're the type of person who thinks, hey, I've never played Paper Mario, let me play the Thousand Year Door, and then have that be your sole experience with Mario RPGs, well, then any Mario RPG fan is going to know you're missing out on so much. You're never going to be able to consume everything. There's just not enough time in the world. I ain't got time for that. But with at least one thing, you should get into a series that requires you to do homework, something that forces you to look up a wiki just to be able to process everything that's ahead of you, something that requires you to do more than just click play and get to the end of a playlist. Maybe you'll have to look up old comics for a TV series that most people never read. Maybe you'll have to find some obscure video games. Maybe you'll need to look up some drama CDs or spin offs or movie releases that are technically not canon and most people don't care about. But hey, even if those early One Piece movies are kind of weird, they're still part of the culture, right? Everyone should do a deep dive at some point in their life. Doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter what it's for. I could have done a deep dive for Urusei Yatsura, which is like 200 episodes. That would have been an even more daunting experience. but would have gotten me to the same endpoint. Would have given me a lot to talk about because Rumiko Takahashi is a very fascinating artist, something I hope will be conveyed more and more as this podcast series goes on. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. I didn't start watching Ranma expecting it to become my new favorite. I didn't go in hoping to, find some hidden gem that's evaded me my whole life. I expected it to just be all right. And it was. It was pretty all right. There's a lot of stuff I enjoy and love about the series. There's stuff that I'm less keen on, but that's most things. I didn't want to find a new favorite. I just wanted context. And it doesn't matter what context it's for. I decided on an artist, and of her many works, I picked one. Could have been anything. Could have been Maison Ikoku. Could have been the mermaid stuff. Hell, could have been Inuyasha. I never actually watched that fully when it was airing in the US. But still, I had my options. I picked the one that seemed the most interesting, and I had a fun time. And imagine if I didn't limit myself to that one author. I literally have a list of old anime that I just have never gone around to, and who knows, some of it is probably trash. Old anime used to have a lot of garbage to it. They used to just air like 50 episodes, and 90% of it is goofy trash that you now only find via YouTube compilations of weird early 90s dubs where they talk about releasing the bees. That's the environment things exist in, and it's maybe not a priority for a lot of people. Well, it doesn't have to be an anime. Maybe there's a video game franchise you've never gotten to touch. And sure, you could play one game in it. I've never played Final Fantasy before, and I'm the weirdo from that BuzzFeed article that wants to start at Final Fantasy 1. I highly doubt I would play every single Final Fantasy game, including spin offs. That's a lot of time. But if I had nothing else going on in my life, maybe I would. There's a billion things that I could deep dive, and no matter what I pick, I would have something to gain on it because I will always approach it with good faith. By the way, everyone, it's me, Elena from the future. I'm currently editing this episode, and I just thought a really important piece of information to share is the fact that the track currently playing is called Lather, Rinse, Repeat. I'll I'll let you guess whose theme this is, but yeah, you're welcome. Anyways, back to the past, Samurai Jack. So I suppose at this point I should maybe give a better idea of what is Ranma one half. See, I kind of buried the lead here with this podcast. I mentioned way at the start that I listen to other podcasts, other, content creators, YouTube channels and such, forum arguments, what other people have to say about Ranma. I was just curious, really. I just wanted to know. And most of these were not Ranma specific. I found a bunch of podcasts about just anime in general, and they would inevitably have a single episode about Ranma. And if you have to cram everything into one episode, that's a lot to cover. So inevitably, everyone just sort of covered the same information. Everyone just sort of regurgitated the same stuff you could read off Wikipedia. That's the feeling that I constantly got. Everyone read the same wikis as me. Everyone found the same bare boned information that you can experience to educate yourself as much as possible without actually having to sit down and learn which Ranma video games are fighting games and which ones are weird MSX games that no one has ever played. That would be unreasonable for me to expect these podcasters to do for one series, especially if they seem to do a million other series. I'm not throwing shade at anyone. The fact that every single podcast I could find regurgitated the same information is simply because that's the only information you need to have. Really, it would be ridiculous of me to expect them to know more or do as much research as I have. That's kind of why this podcast exists. At some point, I figured I had to make something with all this knowledge. It's way too much to put into a single video or a single project. Has to be something long going, something big, because there's so much to unpack there. But what this means is I was left with a bit of a dilemma. I originally planned to have a first episode that just sort of recaps I suppose you could say, the dry summary of Ranma. The type of information you would get by skimming Wikipedia, as opposed to what I did instead, which is have a series of guests where I can sort of summarize all the wacky hijinks, less about the specifics and more about the feeling of Ranma One Half. That's the thing I want to convey. I want to convey the feeling. Because Ranma One Half has some special stuff in it. And as I said, I believe anything could have special stuff in it worth talking about, so long as I approach it in good faith, which I did. So this isn't to say that Ranma One Half is some kind of masterpiece. I don't want to fall for that same trap that so many YouTube video essayists do, where they talk about the things they enjoy as if they're the best things ever. Like I said, Ranma's far from my favorite series, even after I got through it all. It's alright, but that's not why I want to cover everything. I think it's significant in the same way that I think anything a lot of people watched during their childhoods can become significant. Literally anything. It doesn't matter. People will make video essays and podcast episodes about the most obscure thing that they just happen to have experienced as a child, and that will make it the best thing ever. Again, no shade. I just think I can do more than that. So even though Ranma itself is not particularly special, it also is. Anything could be special. And so I want to talk about what makes Ranma special throughout this whole, you know, experience, throughout this whole podcast. And now that I've given you a taste, maybe now we can talk about the drier stuff. We can talk about the Wikipedia articles, because it's good context to have, and also just in general, useful knowledge to have. It's not what I think is the most important, although if I were to just have one episode, then it would suddenly become the most important, because that's the most series encompassing information you could find. But that's not what deep dives are for. When you deep dive something, you want to learn about the obscure stuff. You want to learn enough information so that when you hear other people talk about it, you realize they are wrong. But the only reason they're wrong is because they only watched like 2 seasons out of 160 episodes. I wouldn't expect them to be right, because who's got time to watch all of that? It's too much, really. Hey, if you want a more detailed breakdown of Ranma, I suppose we could get through that. So, first things first, Ranma is an episodic series, right? Well, some people might disagree because they only watched the first 2 seasons of the TV series. And those first 2 sets of arcs are less episodic. For reference, the Ranma series starts off by introducing the main characters. Then we're introduced to the first rival, Tatewaki Kuno, age 17, at the same time as we meet Dr. Tofu, Akane's second love interest. Then focus shifts from fighting Tatewaki Kuno to the love triangle between Akane and Dr. Tofu and her older sister, Kasumi. Then Ryoga shows up. And then here's a new rival. But in the middle of that rival battle, Akane's hair gets cut, and we get stuff with Ranma and Akane, and also the love triangle stuff gets resolved. Then the next rival shows up, and it's Tatewaki Kuno's sister, Kodachi, so he's back, and also Ryoga is now in love with Akane, so a new love triangle gets formed. Then the next fight introduces some one-off characters, but also focuses heavily on the love triangle with Ryoga. And then this arc gets interrupted to introduce Shampoo, who is defeated via Ranma and Akane coming close together and their relationship arc concluding. That's a lot of mixing and matching. It doesn't feel episodic when you summarize it. And if you look at my notes, there's a lot of jumping around. It doesn't feel like you could call some of these storylines arcs. It's more like they're just subplots that exist over the course of multiple other storylines. They're intertwined, and they all culminate in the main arc that is Ranma and Akane learning to like each other. And from this point onwards, Ranma and Akane's relationship does not develop up to chapter 36 of the manga. We finally get the first moment of really seeing how much Akane means to Ranma. They get a touching moment as they defeat Shampoo once and for all, and that concludes their story arc. It creates the new status quo that we will reset to for the rest of the series. It's also the first season of the original TV series. So if you watch the entire first season, it's full of moments like that, like the one I described at the start of this episode. Just moments where you get to breathe, moments where characters get to interact with each other and have those relationships expand. So I've seen people argue that the series isn't actually episodic, which I think is silly because, sitcom style writing can still have character development. It doesn't mean that stuff like that doesn't happen. But it's understandable. If that's all you consumed of the series, it doesn't feel as episodic. There's a lot more interaction between the subplots and the characters. It's hard to decide where one arc starts or ends, which is something I had to parse through as I took my notes to, list everything in order. What counts as the Dr. Tofu arc? I don't think anything does, because he doesn't really get a consistent arc with a beginning and end that doesn't overlap with like 2 or 3 other plots. And that's how we get our first saga. None of them really start or end before everything else gets wrapped up. And then after this, we get the second season of the anime, which covers the second saga of the manga, which begins with, hey, here's a new character, Go Senkuki, and he wants to learn Ranma's weakness, and then he ropes in Tatewaki Kuno, and then we learn that Ranma's afraid of cats, and he's got a secret cat fist style. But then Shampoo shows up, and she turns into a cat. So now Ranma's terrified of her, but she wants to marry Ranma. And here's Shampoo's grandma, and Shampoo's grandma Cologne does all sorts of shenanigans, and eventually does a special curse that makes Ranma sensitive to heat, so now he can't turn back into a boy. And then in the middle of all that movement, ghost shows up and Ranma has to beat him as a girl, thus exposing him to the school. And then after that, he goes back to focusing on Cologne and ultimately defeats her by teaming up with Shampoo, who Ranma has now befriended and works together with so that he can use her cat transformation to trigger his cat fist style, thus defeating Cologne. Once again, it's hard to really determine where one arc begins and ends. It's a series of various storylines that interconnect and mix and match and significantly overlap in places, culminating in a final battle that incorporates several different elements from all the different storylines. And it ends with cementing Shampoo as the second love interest and one of Ranma's allies. And that's her new status quo for the rest of the series. No more changes with her. That's just what she's going to be like from now on. And that ends the second and last of the Ranma sagas. Because from the defeat of Cologne onwards, every storyline now becomes 100% purely episodic. No new obstacles or storylines will be introduced until the previous one is completed. If there is some kind of problem, it will be resolved, and then the next one comes along in order. Zero overlap. There are no exceptions. Even the biggest, most important major arcs do not overlap with any other plot points. They are simply ongoing things. Situations like, say, recurring characters will introduce them and then set up their new status quo so that from that point onwards, if a character shows up, that's what they're going to be. There will be no major changes in anyone's character or personality or situation whatsoever. Episodic, like a sitcom. So, all those podcasts I listen to arguing that, well, Rama's not really like a sitcom because of all these character moments. Like I said, not only does that not make sense because sitcoms are allowed to still have those moments, but also that's two out of seven seasons. That covers all the way up to, what does it have here? Chapter 50 out of over 400. Most of the series is completely episodic. Most of it is a sitcom with wacky hijinks. And yet, that's not the part people remember the most. Again, most people start the series and then eventually they lose interest. They fall off. And then they jump ahead to the ending. Or sometimes they might not even do that. They're simply satisfied. The series is just kind of going in circles, so why continue from there? You've seen the completion of Ranma and Akane's character arcs. You've seen all these new wacky characters get introduced. You know their situations, so you can stop. And if that's where you stop, that's what the series is to you. I can't expect someone to watch the entire series or read the entire manga. That's too much. But it's also interesting how people will talk about the series with such certainty, with such an understanding of what the series was for those one or two seasons that they experience, despite the fact that they know there's more beyond that. They just assume that it's not necessary, that they've seen enough to understand what Ranma is. And again, for most people, that is what Ranma is. Very few people consume it all. Almost no people do what I did and tackle every single piece of media possible. So, who's to say what's accurate or not? I'm not upset that these people are technically wrong because it ultimately doesn't matter. It does not matter that their understanding of the series is not based off a complete experience because the complete experience isn't what most people are talking about when they discuss Ranma. But still, raises the question, If you're talking about a series, but you know that you have a giant blind spot, how can you be certain of anything you say? How can you be sure that the series doesn't contradict your expectations, that your assumptions aren't correct? You can never know. Sure, you can guess, and if no one contradicts you, you can just keep assuming you're also correct. But as exemplified by the fact that some of the stuff I've seen is just regurgitating the same information that's been copy pasted from fan sites for over 20 years. Sometimes nobody's doing the research. Sometimes nobody's correcting you because they also don't know. So you can't really assume that you know everything. And again, you don't need to know everything. It's probably not worth your time. But the fact that you don't know everything means that there are surprises. There could be things that change your understanding. I feel that my understanding of the characters is very different from a lot of people's because I could cite a million examples that could potentially contradict someone's reflection on what a character is. If you only watch the first two seasons, your understanding is incomplete. And even if it's not reasonable for me to expect your understanding to be incomplete, it's not unreasonable for me to state that it's not complete. And, well, again, I'm the giver. I'm remembering it, and I'm establishing what is complete, because I went through it all. And even I have blind spots I couldn't get through. It's not perfect, but I know a lot more than most people talking about it. Hence why I waited several episodes to do this, to just have a recap of everything about the series. Because for most people, this is where the recap would end. This is where their understanding ends, and nothing beyond that is important. But that's not what the series is on paper, even if to a lot of people in their hearts, it is the series. What Rumiko Takahashi created is not necessarily what exists in the minds of most people. And that's what fascinates me, how much something can change in the perspective of someone who isn't going to experience it all. For a series where it's difficult, sometimes even impossible, to have full context. I want to go back to the example I started with. Ranma and Akane eating burgers as nice, relaxing music plays. It's an interesting and touching moment that expands on the plot of the original. Again, 20 pages became an entire standalone episode in one adaptation, and yet the modern remake only does a little over 4 minutes to cover the same information. The same storyline can feel drastically different depending on its presentation. In this version of the story, Kane is upset because of the love triangle stuff. In the original source material, we instantly cut to Ranma getting home, and then he talks to Akane for 2 pages. Then she invites him to spar, and Ranma calls her cute for the first time. And then she goes to bed, maybe considering Ranma in a new light. And that's the beginning of the final transition into the state that Ranma and Akane's relationship will have once they overcome all the shampoo stuff at the end of this saga. In the anime version, however, It's a much more extensive sequence. We actually see Ranma following Akane on the way home. They have the talk before they even get home. And then they have more talk. The scene is almost twice as long. There's more interaction, there's more dialogue that wasn't present in the original source material. Instead of inviting Ranma to spar, Akane simply asks Ranma to grab a bite to eat. And then we get the sequence. They're just eating burgers at the park. Lots and lots of burgers. Some of them were even double burgers. Akane just grabs a double patty burger after having already eaten two burgers. She's very hungry, guys. More importantly, though, they simply talk. Akane reveals a lot of information that is explained in passing in the source material. Things that are either just heavily implied and you can figure it out on your own, or mentioned in passing in small bits of dialogue. But here instead, we get moments of silence of the two characters eating, followed by Akane bearing it all out, and we get flashbacks to her history with Dr. Tofu. It's fleshing out the characters. It's adding things that weren't there originally. Does this mean it is an inaccurate adaptation? Maybe, but it's adding things based on the artist's understanding of the characters. The people who worked and directed this season of the anime clearly wanted to have a quieter show with moments of downtime. They wanted to have those moments where the characters can breathe and just live their lives, where we get to see these facets of them that you know were there, but you don't really get to see very much in the source material. It's clear that Rama and Akane like each other, but how often do you actually see that? It depends. To a lot of people, Akane is just an abusive female character who hits Ranma with hammers, despite the fact that she doesn't actually use hammers all that often. And in fact, most of the cast can use hammers. They just pull hammers everywhere. It takes like 30 chapters for Akane to pull one out after the first time it gets used. She's not the one that uses the hammers. But still, a drastically different understanding of the characters. After this sequence, Rama and Akane have a mild argument that is present in the source material, because Ranma, hearing about Akane's problems, just sort of says something insensitive. That's how he always is. He doesn't respect Akane's feelings. He's telling her to just kind of get over it, you know? So what if this guy who's way too old for you probably doesn't like you or look at you that way? Just get over it. Kane doesn't take too kindly to that. And then we get an extended sequence where Ranma talks to his dad and gets advice from him. Yet another relationship that's getting fleshed out and showing these moments that we assume happened in the original. I mean, Ranma spent his whole life traveling with his dad. They share a room together. Clearly, they must have conversations with each other, even if Rumiko Takahashi herself doesn't show them to us. But it's nice to see them. It's nice to see what their relationship is like. It's nice to see Genma giving terrible advice and having flashbacks to him in his youth being a big dumb idiot, just like Ranma is. And it's nice to see Ranma actually have to learn some kind of lesson before he goes to Akane to cheer her up and call her cute. In the original source material, this entire sequence is 5 pages. Ranma just says something nice to her, she feels good, and that's the whole chapter. Very simple, but the animated version expanded on it so that we see their thought process more. We see more of the characters. We see them fleshed out in ways that are clearly not what Rumiko Takahashi perhaps wanted. Incidentally, this is not too dissimilar to what happened to her other famous work. Urusei Yatsura is a comedic series about a horny teenage boy and his new alien girlfriend who just causes wacky shenanigans. That's kind of the whole series, just wacky comedy nonsense. except instead of martial arts, it's science fiction. Very similar to Ranma in tone, but also very similar to Ranma. The first couple of seasons of this series, once it was adapted, deviate from the source material a little bit. They flesh out the characters, they add filler that expands on concepts in the original. They get weird. This was the set of seasons that was directed by the guy that went on to direct Ghost in the Shell. After all, it's experimental. It's got this sense that the characters have a life outside of Rumiko Takahashi. She created simple characters, and yet people keep reading into those simple characters. They keep wanting to see more. They keep wanting to see these interactions that she only hints at. That's maybe a sign of good writing. She's got a good craft of character creation and building these narratives with these characters that makes you want to care about them and see more of them, even if she herself is not willing to explore those characters and concepts. That's that's the interesting part. Apparently, she wasn't a big fan of those first few seasons of Urusei Yatsura, and drama behind the scenes led to yet another change in production. Well, I say yet another one, but this happened before Ranma 1 half. Still, it's interesting that I now have two nickels about this. The exact same thing that happened with Urusei Yatsura happened with the next adaptation. I'm not sure about the Maison Ikoku adaptation, since those two manga happened at the same time, and as far as I'm aware, there were no big drama shakeups there, but still, two shows in a row where Rumiko Takahashi just wanted to make a silly, goofy comedy where she doesn't think much about what's happening in it, and yet the people asked to adapt that to a wider audience both decided to expand on it and explore these characters because they loved the characters so much. They wanted to have those extra moments. They wanted to treat the characters more seriously. This doesn't diminish the comedy in any way. In fact, I'd argue it makes the comedy better. Sincerity makes things better. Everything's better when you're sincere. Things are funnier when they're sincere. When characters are more than just one dimensional archetypes, you can relate to them more. The things they do and the context in which they do are funnier. I think Shampoo can be a very funny character because I've seen enough material with her in it that I can build a personality around her. Except a lot of stories with her end up going nowhere because she's often treated as just a one dimensional Chinese stereotype with not much personality beyond just she likes Ranma. And that's not fun. It's more fun when there's more to her character, when you have the context of her prior actions to contextualize what she's doing currently on screen. That's how comedy works. As I said before, I don't want to make the mistake of acting like the thing that I'm into is super important. I know Ranma isn't important. I know it is not Rumiko Takahashi's magnum opus. Honestly, I want to consume more of her works, but I spent 6 months on this one. I'm taking a break for now. Who knows? Maybe we will have our Maison Ikoku episode in the future. But I definitely don't want to act like these characters are especially noteworthy. Yeah, I was just singing praises of Rumiko Takahashi's writing. I think they are written well. but they're written well in a way that's just very simple. You don't have to think about it too hard. The way she writes invites people to fill in the details, to play around with these characters and concepts in their head. That's probably why these anime adaptations kept adding to them, kept changing things up, because it's hard to resist. Ranma One Half has more fan fiction than some of the most popular anime in existence, simply because conceptually it invites you to do so. It's asking you to demand more of the characters. You want to imagine them in more crazy scenarios. You want to see the characters develop, even if they're extremely simple. To me, characters don't need to be complex to be good. They can be very simple, but still have a lot of depth to them. Depth is not the same as complexity. Depth is simply when you can look at a character and be questioned. You can challenge your understanding of the character and potentially come out with a new understanding once exploring that. And even if you don't, that understanding can lead to more ideas. You can do so much with the character. Doesn't matter if they're simple. If it works, it works. There's definitely a lot to Rumiko Takahashi's writing style that makes you wonder if she's even aware of her own strengths. She seems very humble. She seems to not think too much about what she's doing. She just does stuff because it seemed like a good idea in her head. It just comes natural to her. She doesn't question the things that pop into her mind before putting them down on paper. That's just how it works. So maybe she's just subconsciously a really good writer rather than someone who puts a lot of thought into their craft. She just happens to be inherently funny. She's a very funny woman. She writes a lot of funny content. Likewise, she writes a lot of good characters. She's not trying to, and I'm going to be honest, there's some stinker moments in there, but even when she's not trying, things just happen. She's not trying to write characters that resonate with trans communities 30 years later, but that's what happened. That's how I hear about Ranma most often when I spot it in the wild. And that was most certainly not the original intention, but her intentions don't matter. What matters is whether she realized it or not, she did some good writing. She wrote something that invited people to ask for more. They wanted to put in more. And so we get these wildly different adaptations. The current remake has been praised a lot. Visually, it's very cute, but I feel like it loses a lot of that energy that the original had. It's very visually pretty, but it's missing something. And is also probably made with insane animation crunch, like most things in the industry. There were definitely a few parts in the series where the art style inexplicably changes, and I have to wonder, was that an intentional decision or was that just a production forced them to do it this way because they didn't have time to do it properly? It is weird sometimes. Sure, they'll have fight scenes where they change the animation style for the significant moments, but other times they'll do it for like a single normal motion that isn't noteworthy at all, and then skip to normal animation again. It's weird. The remake is also just kind of in a hurry. It's it's the type that takes this one storyline that I've almost dedicated an entire episode of this podcast to and turns it into 4 minutes of animation where it's just a direct translation of the panels, but with pretty animation. And even then, it's not the same because Rumiko Takahashi didn't make those manga panels with pretty animation in mind. She made them to be snappy, to be funny. There's a lot of comedic timing in panels that is lost once you switch to an animated medium because now the motion between panels isn't instantaneous. That snappiness is part of the charm. Rumiko Takahashi has amazing comedic timing because she perfectly understands the medium that she's working with. It's not the same with the animation. There's stuff to praise about the Ranma remake, but if I started with that, I definitely don't think it would have appealed to me as much as the original series did. It's just not the same. After the early parts of the manga, the series started to switch things up a bit. The anime adaptation had begun. So maybe perhaps that's the reason Rumiko Takahashi switched to a more episodic format. Maybe perhaps the anime influenced the manga, which in turn influenced the later seasons of the anime as they began to add more and more filler. As the writers for those seasons attempted to figure out Rumiko Takahashi's style. And sometimes they figured it out, sometimes they didn't. But either way, they were mimicking the style that was reflecting their style, which was itself an adaptation of her older style that changed. That's why the middle part of the manga is very different in structure. There's a lot of just here's more characters, they show up and their character arc is done, and now they're just a recurring part of the cast. And then once we got enough of those, we just got a bunch of random one offs. The second half of the manga felt even more episodic because that's when we stopped adding new characters. It became a lot more about just the weird situations. In this chapter, Ukyo finds a cursed spatula because what a goofy idea. There are there are multiple storylines that just kind of feel very repetitive. You can sort of feel Rumiko Takahashi lose steam during those last 100 or so chapters where she started introducing a couple of new characters, but they kind of went nowhere. And then the series just kind of ended. It ended with a 20 or so chapter final epic storyline, which itself followed a 12 or so chapter storyline. It was like 2.5 volumes dedicated to the finale, but that finale could have easily taken place 100 or 2 chapters sooner. The series had sort of fallen off, and perhaps recognizing that, Rumiko Takahashi ended it in a way that doesn't really reflect on what the series had become, but how it was expected to have ended from the very beginning. The anime followed a similar course. As it tried to reflect Rumiko Takahashi's style, it started getting into its own groove, and then uh, viewers began to lose interest. Filler started to become repetitive as well. Sometimes they had good ideas, sometimes they didn't. And then the series just kind of ended. They found a good stopping point with the introduction of Ranma's mom, except that storyline was the introduction of Ranma's mom. It doesn't actually conclude anything. So, some people were a bit disappointed. Hell, people were disappointed in the manga's ending as well. Spoilers, Rama and Akane love each other. Did you know that? The ending of the manga is literally they get together and then it looks like they're gonna have a happily ever after, but then all the wacky hijinks ensue and then it just kind of ends. They just go to school together, they're happy together, that's it. The series didn't need more than that, but some people were still disappointed. I don't share their disappointment, but I understand because if you stuck with something that long, for the people that tuned in every week with these characters, it just became something you really understood. The characters were like family to you. Any series can be like that. I kind of roll my eyes whenever I watch videos of like some old sitcom and how like, hey, uh, Murphy Brown was like a huge icon. Have you seen The Nanny? People love that series. They love these characters. And I'm like, did they? I guess, but you can love anything. Either way, though, the series itself invited us to see more to these characters. It wanted us to demand more. And people demanded more. More than Rumiko Takahashi could ever deliver. But that's simply what the series was. She wasn't there to give us that. It was never her intention. It's up to us to look at the characters and assign value to them. And as long as we approach in good faith, we'll always have something to get out of it. So that was the original Ranma 1/2 series. Except it, of course, kept going. Of course. I talked about these two mediums ending as if they happened simultaneously, but no. The anime ended long before the manga did. So we got years and years of specials and movies and video games that just kept going. Some of these video games even started referencing the manga, which was still going. It never really went away until it did. After the end of the manga, there wasn't a lot of Ranma 1/2 media. There was a special anniversary for Rumiko Takahashi's works in general, which gave us a single special. There was a live action movie at some point, but that's about it. Up until the recent remake of last year in 2024, which came out in the middle of me trying to get through the whole series. It's interesting. Not a lot happened with Ranma between it ending and it coming back, and yet it stayed with us. It stayed with people. To the point where I started wondering what kept it around. I was once challenged by a wise sage to get to the bottom of the mystery. What made Ranma come back? Unfortunately, when I look at the Google trends, I see that Ranma just kind of consistently got less and less results. There were no bumps in interest for Ranma 1/2 until the announcement of the remake. Literally none. And yet that's not how it felt for me. It felt like I started seeing it everywhere. I started hearing people mention the series Ranma 1/2 in conversations. I started seeing YouTube videos about it. I started seeing podcast mentions of it. And then when I started doing my research, I saw there was stuff there, just significantly less than there was before. Even now, with the new remake, Ranma is, according to Google, as popular as it was in 2003, several years after the height of its popularity in the mid 90s. Even though it feels like Ranma came back and has a big resurgence, followed by this new remake, doesn't seem like that's the case. I wonder why it feels that way, though. I wonder why people suddenly took note of Ranma and Columbo. I'm making a call back to that again. Say, did any of you guys see the Simpsons finale episode? No, not the Simpsons finale. It hasn't ended. I'm talking about the Simpsons finale episode, which happened, I believe, a year or two ago, where they made a fake finale. I didn't watch it because, like everyone else, I stopped watching The Simpsons like 20 years ago. It doesn't even matter. It's just kind of there. But I found it fascinating because I saw clips of it. I saw people talking about it. And that finale felt like a finale for a show that existed 20 years ago. There were next to no mentions of stuff that happened in between then and now. Almost no one was discussing the references beyond what they remembered from their childhood in the 90s. In a lot of ways, Ranma is like The Simpsons. And I will continue to make a Simpsons reference in every episode for as long as I can. because ultimately The Simpsons will continue to be the best example of what happens when a series just sort of stays with the zeitgeist long after people stop paying attention. It never left. The Simpsons was always there. It's already dead, but we didn't stop. Ranma did stop though, but it also never left. It was always there. Everyone knew about it, and then eventually everyone suddenly remembered that it was always there and started talking about it again. Google may not show any signs of that, but I felt it. Maybe it was just me. Maybe it was just a handful of people. Maybe the amount of people that suddenly started talking about Ranma was the exact same amount of people that lost interest in Ranma forever. Maybe that's why the results don't show any spikes in searches. Either way, though, Ranma stuck around, and I'm fascinated by people's understanding of it. Again, I don't expect people to go through the experience I did. That's way too many episodes, way too many chapters to read, way too many video games to try and emulate, and then find out that there's a stupid platforming maze in the middle of it. Way too much of it. But it's all there. Anyone can explore it if they want. Shout outs to the fan websites, the YouTube channels I found that were important for the research. Hell, maybe 10 years from now, someone will be doing their own deep dive and they'll find my podcast. Maybe this will be the gateway of resurgence in information. Maybe more people will learn about the time Ryoga got possessed by a cat. And it might go viral. A lot of people saw that clip with the animal crackers scene because it went viral on Twitter the one time. Hell, that was literally my first time seeing a clip from the show, and I loved it. It's one of my favorite jokes. If you haven't seen it, maybe you'll find it someday. It was a big deal. More importantly, though, if you do a deep dive of something, you start to realize how media is just there and how sad it is when we lose stuff. Even if it's present, even if there are technically ways to consume it, you never know. A lot of the stuff I went through, I only found because someone uploaded them to the Internet Archive. Would have been even harder if I did this search a long time ago. I mentioned in the last episode that the only reason I could even experience one of the games at all is because someone did streamed it on Japanese YouTube a year prior. If I had done this deep dive at any point in the last decade, my search might have been incomplete. Sometimes things don't stick around. They stop and they go away forever. Lost media is a sad thing. And sometimes, even when they do stick around, it's just way too much effort. But most importantly, the saddest thing is that when things are lost in a cultural sense, when everyone's understanding of a series is limited to what they learned via the things that people discuss the most. People discuss the first 9 seasons of The Simpsons. You could quote any episode from that era, and most people would recognize it. But if I started quoting stuff from later seasons, it might not hit. That stuff is just lost to the culture. It didn't stick. And that's the stuff that fascinates me the most. It's why I think everyone should do a deep dive. Because you want to find the stuff that didn't stick. You want to find the stuff that people aren't discussing. Everyone talks about the less sitcom-y parts of Ranma in those recaps I saw. People talked about, the parts that they remember most, despite the fact that they didn't even get through half of the series. And that's just how it is. That's the culture. Even if people's discussions and recollections of what Ranma was in those podcasts and YouTube videos isn't accurate, it's what it is to the culture. It's what the culture's feeling. I hope that someday that culture changes for Ranma one half. I've seen it change for other shows. In fact, I think it has changed a little bit, maybe. People used to not talk about trans fans for Rama One Half, and even if that's not the part that I am most interested in, it's something I didn't see 10 years ago as frequently as I do now. Hell, in my research, I found an episode specifically about queer readings of anime, and they had a Ranma episode, and they picked out an episode that is treated as the transgender episode, and I'm like, that's not the episode. I know the trans episode of Ranma. If I were to describe something as the trans episode of Ranma, it's not that. But clearly, these people didn't know about all 161 episodes. So they instead picked the one that they heard about the most. They watched that episode specifically for that podcast rather than going through the entire series. That's what the culture felt. And the stuff that was lost to the culture, well, it's only experienced by people like me who do the deep dive. Everyone listening to this, if you've never done a deep dive into a series before, do it, especially if it's old. There's so much context to gain. That's why I love it. That's why I love gaining context, because there's so much that has disappeared from the culture, and we don't want it to disappear. It's good to learn and keep things alive. That's the thing I'm doing, at least. So I guess from here, well, looking at the time, I haven't talked that long. This is a lot harder to fill up 1 to 2 hours when you're by yourself. But if I had to talk about one more thing, I'm going to talk about the soundtrack, because that's just a hard thing to do in a conversation with someone. When you're in a call with someone, it's hard to just sort of bring up songs from a television soundtrack. There aren't even any lyrics to discuss. It's just, yeah, that sounds good. I'm probably going to play some during this episode somewhere. I just figured, hey, it's worth bringing up because despite the fact that I said Ranma isn't my favorite series and it didn't have that huge of an impact, I could still feel how big of an impact it would have had on me. A lot of the Ranma soundtrack felt nostalgic to me. It felt like something I watched as a kid, even though I didn't. And I'm not sure why. It just has that impact. It feels so of its era, but very iconic for its era. I can feel the emotions that would come up if I had listened to those tracks 20 years ago and then listened to them again now. 20 years from now, long after I've recorded these episodes, I might still feel something major when listening to that music. It's got a feel to it, it's got some kind of charm to it. Again, not much to say about it, but I think it's neat, like a potato. If you've never done a deep dive in a series, again, I don't recommend that you just pick something long that's like 100 episodes and hit play. You'll definitely get a lot of context from that. If you've never watched an old show, hell, even the trashy ones, go ahead and maybe do that. But if you want a shortcut, listen to the soundtrack for a TV series. When was the last time you did that? Not even like the OPs and endings. I mean, like the score, the musical score for old media. Music is very powerful, and they literally don't make them like they used to. Once again, the remake feels like it lacks a charm, and I think part of the reason is because the music just doesn't have that same energy. It's just kind of there. It feels like, hey, this is the story of Ranma Saltome. Whereas the original, you listen to stuff and it's like, you're having some wacky times. Check this out. Or it could be, hey, tune in next time. You'll remember this jingle, right? Doesn't matter. It conveys the emotion. And I guess that's what I've been wanting to do with this podcast. I didn't want to dedicate an episode to just covering the different pieces of media one by one and saying, well, this game was like a Adventures of Lolo clone or something, because that's what Wikipedia told me. No, I wanted to convey the feeling, which is part of why it frustrates me when people just read the Wikipedia page and say what it says, especially when it's inaccurate. The third Ranma One Half movie is not a movie, it's part of the OVA series. That really bothers me, the labeling of some of these specials and what they do and don't count as an OAV or OVA. Hell, the fact that there's two different terms for this type of media is itself something fascinating, maybe for a future episode. But still, if all you do is just read a single wiki page and assume that whoever's writing it knows what they're doing, well, nothing teaches you that that's wrong more than becoming an expert yourself. I have become a Ranma expert, and all I see is nothing but mistakes from people who did not consume every piece of Ranma media. I don't blame them. Like I said, I'm not calling out people in particular, although a lot of the people who edited the Rama One Half fan wiki did a terrible job. I'm not gonna lie. The fact that they have like three different episode orders and they're not consistent between all the pages is kind of a nightmare for navigation. Whoever's to blame for that, I'm not happy with those decisions that were made. But still, I can't blame people for not being experts like me. But once you do become an expert, you realize how much context is lost. I hope that everyone listening to this becomes an expert in at least one thing. You absolutely should. Do a deep dive. Go out of your comfort zone and experience a piece of media that you've never heard anyone talk about. Become the expert. Become the person who tells funny stories in a call as somewhere. Become the person who knows about the obscure pieces of media. I could talk about the weird order of the Ranma image albums. I can talk about the one good episode of Mrs. Columbo that was about the lesbian couple and how the husband of one of them framed the therapist for one of them. That was a good episode. Seems weird. Most people assume Mrs. Columbo was all trash. A lot of it was. There's some good stuff in there. There's always something good to gain if you go in with good faith. I suppose that's the lesson that I've repeated enough. And maybe this can be a short episode. Maybe I can leave you with one last thing afterwards. But I just hope that everyone learned something. Maybe whether it's fun stuff listening to me talk or something that you experience for yourself after finally getting up and consuming a piece of media you've never looked into. There's always something to gain. Please approach it in good faith. Watch bad media, watch bad movies and shows. Don't expect everything to wow you. Don't treat everything like it has to be special. Ranma isn't special. It's kind of dumb and silly, but that's what makes it special. That's what makes it interesting. Everything can be special and interesting as long as you approach it correctly. So, I suppose that's what I'm leaving you off with. Oh, but before I do, I should let you know. Hey, if you don't understand the title of this podcast, why is it called that? Well, first of all, there's a two there. So it looks like the fraction from the Ranma one half, but also it's the translation of the original Ranma theme into English. They actually made English lyrics to paste over the OP. And it's not like a direct translation of the Japanese lyrics. It's a localized version to the tune of the song in English that they presumably were gonna record, but then they didn't. So here's just the lyrics. But you can sing along. You can sing along. Ya papa, don't know what to do. Na 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 na, it's mahjong to you. Just thought I'd say that. I'm very clever with titles. Also, if in case you're curious, I do have an email for the like two people listening to this. So if you want to submit questions to Ranma podcast at gmail.com, I might read them and then I might not talk about them on the podcast because I don't expect people to, but it will at least give me a good way to gauge what the people listening are interested in. Go ahead, ask me about anything. Ask me about any of the stuff that I'll probably have lists of. Like the chapter from the manga about the ugly horse who hates when you call him an ugly horse. That's a good one. Anyways, take care everyone. Ranma bye.